Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous chapter, we talked about the colonial period, concluding with a discussion of the French and Indian War and the period when the colonies really start to begin coming together and eventually thinking about rebelling against the British. But as we concluded that discussion, we're not quite there yet. It's important to note that as of 1763, the colonies remained distinctly British, and for the most part, they were proud to remain parts of the British colonies. Let me read you the words of a Massachusetts lawyer named James Otis in 1764, who wrote, "We all think ourselves happy under Great Britain. We love, esteem, and reverence our mother country, and adore our king. And could the choice of independency be offered to the colonies, or subjection to Great Britain upon any terms above absolute slavery, I am convinced they would accept the latter, subjection to Great Britain. The ministry and all future generations may rely on it that British America will never prove undutiful, till driven to it as the last fatal resort against ministerial oppression, which will make the wisest mad and the weakest strong." So what is it that happens over that next decade or so that drives the colonies into rebellion against Great Britain when, according to James Otis in 1764, they remain loyal British citizens? Well, that is the process we're going to begin discussing in this lecture as we talk about one of the famous ideas of the Revolutionary era, taxation without representation. So in the previous lectures, we talked about the aftermath of the French and Indian War and the recognition on the part of Britain that the colonists needed help in maintaining peace on the frontier, specifically peace between the colonists and the Indians. So they established the Proclamation Line of 1763 to divide the colonists from Indian territory. They also sent a standing army of some 10,000 soldiers to help with this task. Now, these actions begin to become problematic for the colonists for a number of reasons. First of all, the colonists frankly don't like being hemmed in by the Proclamation Line, and very early on, they start kind of literally pushing that boundary and starting to extend their reach across into Indian territory. But they were also very much troubled by the standing army of British soldiers. It's worth noting that these soldiers are typical English troops, meaning that they tended to come from the lowest caste of society. Many among them were rude, crass, profane, dirty, selfish, and generally nasty types. And now, about 10,000 of these individuals are roaming the streets of the colonies. Making matters worse, according to the laws of the English government, these troops are allowed to take jobs in the colonies. Now, they are paid as soldiers, but that was sort of like part-time work for them. So to supplement their income, they can work in the colonies as laborers, craftsmen, artisans, working on ships, or whatever else they wanted to do. The colonies, just coming out of the French and Indian War, fell into an economic depression. Jobs were scarce, people were going hungry, and there was a lot of suffering. And so now, these English soldiers, who are not only generally nasty individuals, but now they're also taking jobs from the colonists who really need them. So, understandably, there are tensions between these soldiers and the colonists. Now, as a final insult, I mentioned this last time, but we're going to be talking a lot about this in the next couple of lectures. Back in London, the English Parliament and government decided that the colonies needed to take up the responsibility for paying for their own protection. So again, adding insult to injury, not only are these soldiers here causing problems and taking jobs, but the colonists are paying for it. Now, it is those acts of Parliament that are going to tax to create that payment that we're going to be talking about shortly. George Grenville, the English Prime Minister who is pictured here, headed the list of English who wanted the colonists to pay for their own protection. And so Grenville enacted a series of acts which passed taxes upon the colonists that would bring in that payment to pay for the troops and the protection that was being sent. First, there was the American Duties Act of 1764, which taxed coffee, wine, and a few other things. Then there was the Sugar Act, also in 1764, which didn't cause a lot of economic hardship for the colonists, but it did importantly set the precedent that the British could pass these kind of taxes. And so many colonists objected to the Sugar Act in 1764. But it was the Stamp Act in 1765 that really drew the greatest reaction at that time. Now, this act put a tax on various kinds of stamped paper, newspaper, legal documents, playing cards, etc. Now, this created quite a stir for a number of different reasons, but one of them is to note that among the colonists who were most affected by this tax were people like lawyers and printers, who are highly educated, who are vocal, and who are knowledgeable about the ways that they might protest against this. So it might not have been Britain's wisest idea to put a tax on the kinds of things that lawyers and printers use the most of. So there came to be this really virulent reaction to the Stamp Act in the colonies. A number of revolutionary leaders are born out of this response to the Stamp Act. People like Samuel Adams in Boston and Patrick Henry in Virginia. Henry, who printed pamphlets that were then spread throughout the colonies and began using this kind of phrase, taxation without representation, that becomes so famous out of this period. There were also a number of riots that evolved out of this, the Stamp Act riots. In Boston, a group called the Sons of Liberty, made up of merchants, printers, lawyers, and common people, reacted to the Stamp Act. For instance, one of the stamp distributors, a man named Andrew Oliver, was hung in effigy. Mobs paraded through the streets, marched to Oliver's house, and destroyed it. At the mob's insistence, he resigned in the aftermath of that attack. Similarly, on August 26, 1765, the crowd descended on another official's house, Thomas Hutchinson, which was one of the more beautiful houses in the city. The mob destroyed the house, tearing it piece from piece, pulling the shingles off of the roof, and eventually pulling down the whole roof itself. There were similar actions to this spread all up and down the colonies. All but two of the stamp distributors in the colonies were forced into retirement. And by this forcible resistance, the colonies, in essence, stopped the tax. At the same time, they initiated a boycott of British goods, which we'll be discussing in the next couple of lectures. As a result of all of this, George Grenville was eventually replaced and the Stamp Act was repealed. However, it's worth noting that even as the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, stating that Parliament can legislate for the colonies in all matters whatsoever. In essence, we repeal this one act, but we reserve the right to implement other acts as well. Now, this is a famous cartoon, political cartoon, that comes out of this period depicting the response to the Stamp Act. And we see in the background the Liberty Tree and the Stamp Act upside down on the tree. This is one of those stamp distributors who has been tarred and feathered and is now being forced to consume hot tea, another controversial item which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. And you also see a noose hanging ominously in the background as perhaps a symbol of what is the next fate of this stamp distributor. So, the Stamp Act, all of the actions we've talked about, start to bring about this unified reaction across the colonies. The colonies are starting to come together in their voice against the actions of the British government. So in the next lecture, we're really going to talk about how this escalates and ultimately coalesces into the revolution itself.